A little while ago, I talked about the Stiljager, this group of post-war Soviet teens who loved jazz and hated repression. This time we're going to talk about one of the things that they used to get their naughty books and banned records across the Soviet Union. Welcome to the interesting tale of Samizdat. Samizdat? One of the ones. Samizdat, which roughly translates to self-printing, is just that. Essentially, someone would take a book banned by the authorities, somehow make a copy of it and distribute it one way or another. The quality was low, it wasn't easy to come by, and if you were caught, have fun in Russian prison. But it worked. It connected people unhappy with the falling apart status quo of the Soviet Union together, allowing these people to appreciate some bits of Western culture the Eastern Bloc governments didn't want people seeing. It was more than just translations though, as eventually it led to an underground culture of sharing information. Some of you might know about fanzines, which are these little indie magazines you used to get before the internet. Well, if you imagine that, but even knowing about it could get you into a lot of trouble, that's your average Samizdat publication, of which there were many. From publications giving Russian Jews hope of making Aliyah, to anti-establishment reporting on Soviet corruption, to even getting Russian writers who couldn't get their works published the normal way out to the masses, the system of Samizdat opened minds. Though the circulation was admittedly quite small and mostly just Soviet academics, it was still way better than nothing. And while I keep saying Soviet Union in the video, it's important to note that Samizdat was commonplace in pretty much every Eastern Bloc country, like Czechoslovakia and Poland. Now, obviously, the KGB weren't that happy about this kind of thing existing. Way before people even had a chance to think of something like Samizdat, they'd started something rather scary. For example, every single Soviet typewriter and printer printed slightly differently, enough so that the KGB could take a writing sample and store it somewhere, allowing them to work out exactly where it came from. Today, having fingerprints like that are everywhere. Your printer, for example, prints these tiny little dots onto every page to help Interpol find counterfeiters. But it's not really the sort of thing you would expect from the 40s. Now, there was a big hole in this scheme. Sure, you could easily trace Joe Bloggs, or Imurek, back to his typewriter if it was made in Russia. But if, let's say, he bought it abroad, or worse, had smuggled it in from the West, the plan wouldn't work. A lot of the more professional Samizdat writers did this, along with some other creative measures to make the process a little bit easier, like typing on a couple of bits of carbon paper so they would have multiple copies of their writing. From hiding their publications and other books, to hooking up their copying jobs to Soviet mainframe computers and deleting the trail of info, the people, not the government that allegedly represents the people, began to build quite the robust system of sharing information. And as I alluded to before, it wasn't just one type of media being sent out to the people. All sorts of books and magazines got published through Samizdat. Unfortunately, a lot of them have now been lost to history, but what does still exist is still quite interesting. For example, the Chronicle of Current Events. Published for almost 20 years, this magazine detailed the many human rights abuses conducted by the Soviet Union with surprising accuracy. And there are dozens of literary magazines that existed in the ether as well, delivering poetry and novellas to the public the Soviet system just didn't want out there. Pretty much everything you could think of got published somehow through Samizdat. Religion, which was heavily repressed or banned during the Soviet Union, was free to exist in the Samizdat world, so Christian texts, pro-Russian Orthodox pamphlets, and Jewish publications existed during this time. Lots of political stuff, some pro-democracy, some pro-liberal, some conservative, some pro-Soviet as well. Bit weird. And of course a fair amount of erotica. Soviet writers at the time of Samizdat likened it to a vice like binge drinking. Once you started, you couldn't stop, and there was just so much variety to choose from. Of course, it wasn't perfect by any means. You know when you send a picture to someone and it looks a bit crap, and then they send it to someone else, and then they send it to someone, and just, blurry mess. Samizdat was infamous for this. It was blurry, poor quality, and hard to read. But it was the only option, and people couldn't really get too fussy. An anecdote I read in a paper about Samizdat suggested that many people's reading of important anti-Soviet texts, like the Gulag Archipelago, were made all the more poignant by the tremendously bad reading experience. I mean, after all, a good government wouldn't let you read it like that, would they? And of course, if people are typing it up on their own and making copies of copies, just imagine the sheer amount of typos and mistranslations from one copy to another. And of course, the amount of people that are cutting stuff out to save time. There's a lot of anecdotes that suggest that translators didn't bother translating whole passages either because it was too long, or simply because they didn't like it. Authors also tended to get their work misattributed or misspelled or worse. And of course, the KGB definitely did do stuff to writers that they caught. Much like the bone record distributors we discussed in the Stilyaga show, the Soviet government loved to round up and arrest anyone involved in Samizdat, dishing out long prison sentences in return. The most famous case of the Union punishing Samizdat writers was the Trial of the Four. Poet Yuri Galanskov, publisher Alexander Ginsberg, writer Alexei Dobrovolsky, and typist Vera Lakova were arrested by the Soviet Union for creating Samizdat. In what can only be loosely described as a trial, the four were found guilty and sent to prison, with their defence lawyers also being barred from practising law again. Eventually, by the late 80s though, it started to not be necessary anymore. Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost era ended the need for printing books underground, and by 1991, almost all the big publications had folded. Today, this sort of smuggled information is a lot easier with computers. The concept of transferring stuff by memory stick, or sneakernet, is commonplace in repressive regimes today, like in North Korea and with Cuba's Paquet Salmonelle project. Reading about both has made me realise that there could be a good episode in that too, so subscribe for that. And of course in Russia today, people are free to access the media in any which way they choose, as long as the government okays it, and the FSB. Good to see that times haven't really changed that much.